remember the first night because of the rule that didn't exist until I noticed it. The rule that the lights in the hallway of the apartment building would always turn off exactly 3 seconds after I passed them. Not 2 seconds, not 5, always 3. And the first time it happened, I thought it was just one of those motion sensors with a delay, the kind landlords install to save money. But after living there for 2 weeks, I realized something about the timing felt too precise, too aware, because the lights never turned off when anyone else walked through. Only when I did, and I started counting without meaning to. 1, 2, 3. Click. Darkness behind me, like someone quietly closing a door, and at first it just felt strange, the kind of small detail your brain files away as a coincidence. But the thing about coincidences is that they start to rot when they repeat too often, and the night it really started, I was coming home around midnight after a late shift, the hallway, quiet except for the soft buzz of fluorescent lights. And as I walked the long stretch toward my door, I noticed the first light shut off behind me after the usual 3 seconds. But then the next light ahead of me flickered once before I even reached it, like it already knew I was coming. And that was the moment something cold settled in the back of my mind. Not fear exactly, just the uncomfortable awareness that a pattern had changed without asking permission. So I slowed down and watched carefully, stepping forward and waiting, and when the next light turned on before my foot crossed beneath it, I stopped walking completely and the light stayed on as if it was waiting for me to continue. And I remember standing there in the hallway with groceries in my hands, listening to the building breathe through its pipes, wondering why it suddenly felt like the hallway was reacting to me instead of the other way around. And I tried to laugh it off because people notice weird things when they're tired. But the next night, the pattern changed again because the lights didn't turn off behind me anymore. They stayed on longer than usual, stretching the hallway with pale white light that followed me almost all the way to my door before finally clicking off. And that was the first time I turned around to check if someone was behind me, even though I already knew there wasn't, because the building was old and quiet, and I had heard the main door close when I came in. And still something about that lingering light made me feel like the hallway was watching to see where I would go. And after that, I began noticing other rules I had never paid attention to before, like how the elevator would sometimes stop on my floor even when nobody called it, the doors opening to an empty hallway like someone stepping aside at the last second, and how the number 3 kept showing up in small places, 3 seconds before lights shut off, 3 soft knocks in the pipes at night, 3 floors above mine where no one officially lived. And I only learned that last part because one evening I asked the landlord about the empty floors while we were talking outside, and he looked confused for a moment before saying, "There were only 2 floors above mine, not 3. And I laughed because I thought he misunderstood, but later that night when I counted the stairs while climbing up just to check, I reached a landing that technically shouldn't exist. A narrow hallway above the top floor with 1 single light and 3 identical doors, all closed, all silent. And the weirdest thing wasn't that the hallway existed. It was that the light there turned on before I even stepped onto the landing, the same way the lights downstairs had started doing, like it already knew I was coming. And I told myself it was just another maintenance corridor the landlord forgot to mention. But when I looked back down the stairwell, I noticed the lights behind me turning off one by one in that slow 3-second rhythm, climbing the stairs toward where I stood as if the darkness itself was catching up. And suddenly the quiet of that upper hallway felt heavier than it should have, the kind of silence that presses against your ears, and I remember thinking I should probably leave. But curiosity kept me there long enough to notice something about the doors, something so small I almost missed it. Each door had a number on it, and every number was my apartment number, repeated 3 times. And I stood there trying to understand why 3 different doors would all have the same number as mine, when somewhere below me, my real apartment door waited exactly where it always had. And before I could convince myself to open one of them, the light above me flickered once and then turned off, leaving the landing completely dark. And behind me, down the stairwell, I heard the faint click of another hallway light shutting off. After 3 seconds, like something marking time in the building, the second story started months later when I moved out of that building. And for a while, I told myself the strange patterns there were just the result of an aging electrical system and a tired imagination. But the reason I stopped believing that was because of the radio in my car, the one that started whispering my street names, before I reached them. And the first time it happened, I was driving home late at night through unfamiliar neighborhoods, letting the GPS guide me while the radio played quiet music in the background, and halfway through a song, the signal cracked with a burst of static that sounded almost like breathing before a voice quietly said the name of the next street I was about to turn onto. And I thought maybe it was some kind of traffic broadcast cutting in. But the strange part was the timing, because the GPS hadn't announced the turn yet, and the voice said the street name exactly 3 seconds before the navigation did. And after that, the music resumed like nothing happened. And for the rest of the drive, I kept waiting for it to happen again, but the radio stayed silent except for normal songs. So I told myself I must have misheard something in the static. But the next night it happened again. The same soft interruption, the same quiet voice saying the next street before the GPS could always 3 seconds earlier. And the voice didn't sound robotic or automated. It sounded calm and human, almost thoughtful, like someone sitting beside me, reading directions from memory. And after a week, the pattern became impossible to ignore, because the radio would predict every turn before the GPS, not minutes ahead, just those same precise 3 seconds. And one night, curiosity got the better of me, so I deliberately ignored the next turn to see what would happen, and the GPS recalculated the route as expected. But the radio stayed silent for a long time, until suddenly the static returned, and the voice quietly said my name. Not loudly, not urgently, just softly, the way someone might say it if they were checking whether I was paying attention. And I nearly pulled the car over, because hearing my own name from the speakers felt completely different from hearing street directions. But before I could react, the voice calmly said the name of a road that wasn't on my GPS at all. And for some reason, I turned onto it without thinking. Like the suggestion slipped past my judgment. And the strange thing about that road was that it looked familiar, even though I knew I'd never been there before. Long, empty stretches of asphalt with streetlights that flickered exactly 3 times before turning on. And after a few minutes, I realized the radio had gone silent again, leaving only the quiet hum of the engine and the distant buzz of lights turning on ahead of me, as if the road itself was guiding me somewhere. And when I finally checked the GPS, I saw that it had completely lost my route, the map spinning slowly like it couldn't recognize where for days, the voice said. You're almost for days. The voice said, you're almost there. And I remember the moment those words sank in, because I suddenly realized something I hadn't considered before. The radio had never once told me where there was supposed to be, and the road ahead stretched into darkness with another streetlight flickering on exactly 3 seconds before I reached it. The last story is the one that still bothers me the most because it didn't happen in a building or a car or anywhere unusual. It happened inside my own apartment where everything should have been predictable, and it began with the sound of footsteps in the room above mine, even though I lived on the top floor. And the first time I heard them, it was late at night, while I was lying in bed, scrolling through my phone. A slow rhythm of steps moving across a ceiling that shouldn't have had a floor above it. And I sat up listening carefully, because the building had a flat roof and nothing but air above my apartment. And the steps were soft but deliberate, pacing from one end of the ceiling to the other before stopping directly above my bed, and the silence that followed felt strangely patient, like whoever had been walking was waiting for something. And after about 3 seconds, the footsteps began again. But this time they matched my movements exactly, because when I shifted in bed, the steps above shifted too, staying perfectly aligned with where I moved. And at first I tried to convince myself it was some kind of echo from another apartment or pipes expanding in the cold. But the pattern became impossible to ignore over the following nights. The steps would start only after I entered the bedroom, pacing slowly across the ceiling until they found the exact spot above wherever I was standing, and they always paused there for 3 seconds before continuing, and eventually curiosity turned into something closer to dread, because I realized the steps weren't random. They were learning my routine, moving faster when I walked faster, stopping when I stopped, as if the ceiling itself had become a mirror that followed my movements from above. And the night it truly unsettled me, I decided to test something. I stood in the middle of the room and remained completely still, refusing to move even slightly. And for a long time, the apartment stayed silent except for the distant hum of traffic outside. But then slowly, carefully, a single step sounded directly above my head, even though I hadn't moved at all, followed by another step and another, each one circling the exact spot where I stood, like something pacing around me from the other side of the ceiling. And I remember the strange realization that came with that moment. The footsteps weren't mirroring me anymore. They were mapping me, learning the shape of the room through where I stood. And after 3 slow circles, the steps stopped completely and the silence stretched long enough that I thought it might finally be over. But then the softest sound I had heard yet came from directly above me. Not a footstep this time, but something closer to knuckles, tapping lightly against the ceiling. 3 gentle taps spaced exactly 3 seconds apart. And I don't know why, but instead of leaving the room, I found myself staring upward, waiting to see if it would happen again. Because by then I had started to recognize the pattern, the lights, the radio, the footsteps, all of them reacting just slightly ahead of me, like something was always 3 seconds closer than it should have been. And the thought that still stays with me now is the possibility that whatever learned those patterns never stopped learning. Because sometimes, late at night, when my apartment is completely quiet, I still catch myself pausing in the middle of a room for no reason at all, waiting through that familiar stretch of silence, counting slowly in my head. 1, 2, 3, and listening for the sound that might already know exactly where I'm standing.